currently I've been here for over 5 years, which is absolutely ridiculous to me. But something self-indulgent right at the top. This is also my 3rd year teaching sacred studies at Mead Hall. And I love it. When I first got that job, I was really nervous because I was a youth pastor for 5 years. And so I want to hang out with like Nick and Aubrey and Connor and crew. And like, I was so nervous about like these little kids who don't, like know to keep all their clothes on yet and will spit on you and sneeze in your face or whatever it was. I was very, very scared. But after 3 years, I can say like, I love those kids, and high schoolers can take a hike. No offense. Like, they're just so awful. And the young kids are great and fun, and the stories are all good, and they know things. They're not looking for a point, and they're not looking for a moralism. And I try and shove it down their throats anyway in chapel. Like, just don't lie to people, because they do it all the time. But they love and they play and enjoy these stories. And I get really, really fun phone calls, like I probably shouldn't use his real name, so I'll just say from David's mom. And David's mom had to call me after a really great kindergarten lesson one day. She was like, "Thank you so much. You're like the best sacred studies teacher he's ever had." I'm the only sacred studies teacher he ever had. But he's going home. He's learning so much. He is crucifying all his action figures, though. So I don't know if you want to talk to him about that or whatever, but he full on had Captain America on a cross. And I was like, okay, fair point. So we got to worry about that. But to this point, like, you'll find dolls like in the Jesus pose, and it's, you just kind of make them happier or whatever else. But that's how kids work. And at recess sometimes they'll be crossing the sand, sandbox, like, oh, we're so tired. We got to find the promised land. We got to find it. And I love that. They find themselves in the story. This week, when I went from like new church relaunch, here we go, this is so exciting and there's things to talk about, to like, boy, I don't know if this is the week for that. Like, you don't, throw someone a surprise birthday party at a wake. When all of these kind of things seem to be happening, like by Saturday in the middle of the day, I was like, there's no way. Like, we got to do something. So I just started trying to find us in the story, to bring something this morning to share together and go out like we always do. And the good news is I did find us in this story. So crisis averted. Hooray. The bad news is I found us in the story of King David, who I'm not very high on. Like, King David gets a lot of like praise and things. He's like a more manly Jesus. Like, he's God's favorite, but he like went to war and killed a giant with a stone. That's awesome. But David also had a lot of failings and pain and suffering and imperfection, and it just gets so mired. But that's where we are. And the more I thought about King David's story, I kind of saw like what a microcosm of maybe how the world's been feeling lately this is. And the moment that I want to catch up with David is a little bit later. King David, who came from nothing, not even presentable with his father when people came looking for a king. King David was crowned king, and he was ruling, and he had all of these dreams and visions for the kingdom and his kingdom and the temple he wanted to build. This was the culmination of a story, generations in the making, like their whole lives. People had been waiting and ready for this, to see the culmination of the promise. They had been told since they were little that they were going to bless the entire world through them. They're going to change the world. God's finally going to do God's thing. And David grew up with that too. And he gets into power and he has all these visions like, I am going to build this awesome temple. That doesn't really happen. David replaced King Saul, who failed the monarchy. I mean, we're one in and already the king is bad. And like, God chose that king, so what are you going to do? But now David's on the throne. Now things are fine. We have the promised land. We're not in slavery anymore. David's had sons. He's had Amnon and Tamar, the daughter. And then there was this one guy, Absalom, that David had. And wrapped up in these children are the future of the people and David's hopes and dreams. I don't know if you remember anything about Absalom, but I'll tell you some things about him. Absalom had a great head of hair. He was a very handsome, charismatic guy. I don't know if that reminds you of any pastors you know, but he was a really good looking dude. And so Absalom had this really high opinion of himself. He really did. And his relationship with his father, as it's chronicled, David was either spoiling him rotten or bringing the hammer down, like with the severity that only your dad, the king, can do. This did not lead to a stability of character. Absalom is this kind of crazy character. When his older brother Amnon ends up getting in trouble for his lustful, crazy ways, Absalom kills him. And no matter how right you are or how justified that might be in his mind, you kill your king father's oldest son, it's going to strain that relationship a little bit. And when the general Joab would not help him patch things up with David afterward, Absalom, in his anger and just to be a jerk, burns down Joab's fields of grain. It kind of hearkening back to the story of Samson, who did it with foxes. So David hates this kid almost as much as he loves this kid. The people, by the way, thought he was awesome, right? Like all of this daring do, like all of this, oh man, he's a real go-getter. What a character. Finally, someone who gets things done, And so they just thought he's this charismatic person in the political dynasty. And so eventually, when they keep being strained and almost inevitably to us, he ends up rebelling against his father. A lot of the people go with him. And now it's Absalom versus David. And this is not the future for the people that David thought was in store, or the future that he wanted. And the night before the battle, David is a wreck. Because of course, as the king, he's got responsibilities. He's got to protect this kingdom that God has raised. He's got to do these things. It's bring the hammer down time. But as a father, that's so far from anything he wants to do, to the point where he goes to his generals before the battle and pleads with them. Listen, if Absalom falls into your hands, please take it easy on this kid for my sake. I don't know if my heart could take it. Right? David wants to protect the kingdom. He wants to protect his son. It's just those two things seem so unable to coexist. The fight happens, and as it happens, in kind of a mythical, fabled turn of events, Absalom's beautiful head of hair that was long and flowing, as he's kind of running from his pursuers, it gets caught in a tree. And so outside of town in the country, you have this would-be king hanging from a tree by his hair. And who should find him but Joab, who you might remember had all of his fields burned by this little upstart jerk of a kid. There is no mercy to be found in Joab that day, and he just runs him through. When the news gets back to David, David cries out with words that echo through history to this day, where he wishes, Absalom, my son, oh, Absalom, my son, how I wish I would have died instead of you. Parents wish that for their children, I think, from what I've been told. And parents can sometimes die for their kids, but kings can't do that. Not at the expense of the kingdom. And this story and this family give us a pretty good picture of what people in life are like, because people can be a thorn in your side and the apple of your eye at the same time. Don't look at your spouse. Eyes on me. How dare you? Okay, well, you're excused. Life can be the most beautiful thing you've ever experienced and gut-wrenchingly tragic at the same time. Almost all the time. There's battle and death. Kings can't die for their children because that's not how you save the kingdom. Kings don't save kingdoms that way. And in times where we get desperate or passionate or focused, missional, when we are missional people, no matter what that looks like, when we're asking, what does God want from me? The question we're kind of asking is, how do we live in the kingdom? How do we further this kingdom? Like, what's our goal and mission, and how do we do this? And when you're born and raised inside the kingdom, like a lot of us were, some of us maybe did not. Maybe you came to church at a later time, but we can think and hope maybe because if you've had a pretty good sheltered life, you know, the kingdom would be well on its way if everything went right. If there was just less tragedy. If things hadn't worked out like this. If things had gone according to plan. If I didn't have to fight with Absalom, says King David. But take Absalom out of the picture and David can't escape David's self. I mean, this is hardly the only thing David has had to work with. I mean, his own sin and trouble gets him in bad with God to the point where, ironically for today, there's this pestilence or plague that spreads throughout the people. Now, thank God we don't have to ascribe such meaning to things, but the narrative casts their plague as, hey, you messed up, and there's going to be a reckoning. David can't save the kingdom that way. We all want celebrated people and movements and things. I mean, I don't know, like when you were like young in the church, right? And you had like this idea, like I'm thinking of every youth rally I ever went to, right? Like where our guitars were just as rocking as the world's and the preachers were like so assured and the good was flowing and the church seemed perfect. I wonder how you envisioned everything working out. And we want celebrated people and movements to have this kind of like happy, good existence where there's some escape to the nonsense and the mortality and the failure. But it doesn't matter whose biography you read, life hardly ever works out that way. And there's never this neat, tidy bow on it, happy ending. And this is not, to be sure, the future that people are hoping for. They've seen it come to pass, right? The only thing worse than not getting what you want is what? Getting what you want. The people now, like they're not slaves, they're not wandering, they're not led by judges. They don't have a bad king, they've got God's king, God's guy on the throne. And this is it, finally now they have to cross the finish line. But what happens? Pestilence, moral failure, civil war, unrest. Little did they know, soon the kingdom would be split in two. This is not that future. And there's no allegory here or moralism for us today, I think. Rather, it is in this story that what we said at the start, I just want you to see yourself in this story today. David's lament, David's pain, and David's just existence is captured in this story in a psalm of lament, Psalm 13, that I want us to say together and examine today. If lament is a new word for us, you look it up in the dictionary and it'll be like an expression of grief. And that's one part of it. Absolutely. Like that's what laments are. It's a song of grief, an expression of what's wrong. There's also this kind of edge to it where it's like calling God to be accountable to God's promises. Not in a way that is arrogant, but like there's this kind of backwards faithfulness to it, right? Where as God's accuser of like, I thought you would do this, and what about your promises? What are you doing? It means I affirm that you're God, and I was expecting this from you, and I know that you can do this. So what's up? What's the deal? And so before we make one turn, I thought it'd be good for us to not just read and hear this together, but if you would, read it with me. We'll go verse by verse up until around like verse 4, I think. but would you read with me, and I'll tell us when to stop. How long, O Lord, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? How long must I bear pain in my soul and have sorrow in my heart all day long? How long shall my enemy be exalted over me? Consider and answer me, O Lord my God. Give light to my eyes, or I will sleep the sleep of death. And my enemy will say, I have prevailed. My foes will rejoice because I am shaken. If you would go back to verse 1. Yeah, there are 2. I just want to take a minute. Chris, you spend like 10 seconds a slide. Just let's take a moment, read, and for any word or phrase that you would be like, that kind of expresses something I relate to today. No expectation. You don't have to meet a quota of talking back. But anything jump out? Anything come to mind?
I mean, there was a time in my life where after my mom left, where I felt like that. I think we all have those times.
I promise this is a story I offer for humor, but when you go to be a pastor, a responsible denomination will require you to jump through many hurdles and pass many tests. And one of the byproducts of that is we got free access to thousands of dollars worth of psychoanalytical counseling and tests and things. And we had to go into this meeting with a psychologist and counselor in Nashville who's a part of the church. And he looked at me and said, hey, listen, we have to have a hard conversation because you scored at very high risk for self-harm or suicide. And I was like, what? Okay, I'm all right. Like, it was, and depressive things are great. And I tell you, but at the time, this is news to me because this is a pretty good season. And as he's going through, he's like, well, on this question, it was like, I enjoy things that are like melancholy or sad. And I had marked oh yeah, absolutely true. And so I was like, oh yeah, there's nothing better than a good tragedy. And so I was like Shakespeare, it was so great. And then, we're talking about the stories and things and movies, and the best stories include heartbreak. I'm a fan of every comedy out there, but I feel stuff that reaches the human condition, tragedies. And I'm glad this story is in the Bible because it lets us know, I mean for real, on the deepest true sense, that unhappiness and tragedy and regret are part of God's story and are part of living as a family in the middle of God's story. It's true for King David. It's true for your house. It's true for my house. We're in a mess. We're in a messy world. And I love your family, but no offense, it's messy. Full of messy people. We can't get everything together. There's regret. It doesn't always work out the way we plan. We can't make it all work out right. And if we're hurt by our own families, The tragic and good news is, how much more is God hurt by God's human family? What's to become of David's troubled family or ours? Because here we have a story of a beloved son outside of town, hanging in a tree, being run through with a spear, and people just trying to keep the kingdom together. And the king wants to die for his son, but he can't, because kings can't do that. But God's can. It takes a God to die for the kingdom. Because generations later in David's family, there's a cross raised outside the capital city. And on that hangs a beloved son, hanging not because of his own rebellion, but because of our rebellion. The Father gives everything for the kingdom, even his own son. And the cross does not set everything right. It doesn't erase the seriousness or the pain of the evils we've committed or people have committed or the brokenness of the world. Rather, it makes it possible for life to continue, even with all of the tragedy. David said he would have given his life to save his son from death. And at Calvary on the cross, God does it. And God's whole tragic human family, in some weird way, is gathered up, embraced, and saved by a grieving Father who, despite our sins and grief and brokenness and pain, still loves us and still works and still moves and calls the church into existence and gives resurrection life and hope. Every time we come into this place, we do not come into this place as Absalom being spoiled by our Father because we're just so loved and the favorite. You're not just the good Christian child who fulfills the dreams of the Father, and that's why you get the gifts. We don't come in here like Absalom getting the hammer brought down on us because you're so wicked and awful and you need to pray for our forgiveness right now. God help you if you're going to make it through the other week. But we do come in here as beloved children who are imperfect, and yet we come as recipients to God's self-giving gift, where God gives up every dream of the kingdom, every dream of conquest. Right? Like this is the Jesus we encounter today. That is to say, Jesus forgets the idea of being a conquering king, this warrior, this person who makes everything right, who sets the world right by might. Jesus says, I will risk it all on self-giving love and relationship. So he forsakes heaven for our sake, and in the process brings heaven down, and we've been pulling it down ever since. So when we feel pain, when things don't work out, I thought we'd be taking communion in a newer, brighter, bigger space today. But somehow, Jesus and the Spirit still show up. And we still have it better than most. When you feel pain, when things don't work out, when life seems broken, I pray that wherever you look, you'll find yourself in this story. And no, we are not outside the grace of God, that we are still people called by mission. There are still Janets, and there are still babies, and there are people who are hurting, who need a church, like a real one. That's who I want to be. That's who I'm depending on you to teach us how to be authentically the body of Christ. That we don't get hung up by our own pridefulness as much as we offer ourselves up, I hope, in sacrificial love. Jesus shows us how, and he invites us to the table. So if you would partake communion with us today, you are invited to come to the table. There's hand sanitizer here. After we've all received our elements and returned to our seat, we will partake together today. So you're invited. Come.